Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to this special online event on shifting the emphasis on the social in ESG. It is good to see so many joining today's program. Thank you. We will do our utmost to inform you well and leave you with new insights on how we all can help counter growing inequalities and social disruptions that we saw as a consequence of the pandemic. My name is Irina van der Sluis, and I'm a Senior Responsible Investment Specialist here at NN Investment Partners. And I will be the moderator of today's session. Today's topic is close to my heart, and I look forward to sharing our investment approach that now more than ever incorporates these social transformations. For example, via our impact equity and social bond strategies. My colleagues Marina Iodice and Douglas Farquhar will address these topics later and provide real-life examples of how responsible investment can make that social impact. Before they join the conversation, I have the pleasure to talk to Bettina Reinboth, Director of Human Rights and Social Issues at UNPRI, and with Professor Tim Jackson of the University of Surrey, and he is Director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. With Bettina, we will discuss the increasing governmental pressure to provide proof points for social impact, as well as meaningful engagement with companies on respecting human rights in supply chains. Tim Jackson, who, as an ecological economist, will address the interdependence of human economies and natural ecosystems and how finance plays a part in that just transition. Before we start, a kind reminder to all of you that we like to hear from you during this event. Please share your comments or questions via the chat and let us know by using the @ if they are addressed to Tim, Bettina, Marina, or Doug. Should you run into technical difficulties, please try refreshing your browser or reach out to @NNIP Helpdesk in the chat. Now we're almost ready for our first speaker. But on a day like this, where we put the spotlight on people and the importance of safeguarding basic human rights, we acknowledge that we are witnessing war back in Europe. Our hearts go out to the people in the Ukraine and all the refugees trying to find a home away from home. And we feel deeply connected as we fully realize that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. Joining us virtually from London, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Tim Jackson. Tim, in your TED Talk 10 years ago, you were already at the forefront of these issues. And what particularly captured my attention was the way you used then a quote of Mary Douglas to wake us all up to a more humanizing vision of our place in the economic system. We wonder why this hasn't happened yet, Tim. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Irina. And thank you especially for inviting me to talk about the global importance of the S in ESG. I want to start with a story. This is a picture of a magumo tree, a species of wild fig which used to grow all over the slopes of Mount Kenya in Africa. Its bark is the colour of elephant skin, its fruits ripen to a warm orange colour. In summer, the branches are alive with song from the birds who feast on them. And wherever it grows, the magumo throws a thick 20-metre canopy above lush, fertile undergrowth, nourished by streams which have broken through the rocky soil from the groundwater below. The tree holds a special place in the hearts of the local Kikuyu people. In her memoirs, the Nobel laureate, Wangari Maathai, tells the story of her own childhood there, fetching water from the streams and bringing firewood home, But never, her mother would tell her, from the Magumo tree. Why not? The young Wangari would ask. Because it's sacred, she was told. We don't use it, we don't cut it, we don't burn it. When a Magumo dies, the Kikuyu insist on planting another one close by as soon as possible. Matai was just 20 when she left Mount Kenya to study biology, first in the US as part of the Kennedy Airlift, and then in Nairobi. By the time she returned to Mount Kenya, the trees were gone, cut down to make way for tea plantations. The lush undergrowth had disappeared, the soil was arid, the streams that sprang up through the rocky earth had all dried up. With the eyes of a child, Wangari mourned the loss. With the mind of a scientist, she grasped its devastating logic. Without the trees, the soil was unstable. Without the roots, the groundwater was inaccessible. The springs failed, the birds fell silent. The land and its people suffered the consequences. Her mother's simple folklore had been a code designed to protect not just the Magumo, but the people who depended on it. A code swept away by the advance of Christianity, capitalism, and tea, that dark, wondrous beverage on which trade and empire were built. Why am I telling you this? Well, first, of course, I'm a Brit. Tea is never far away from my mind. Then there's the fact that for quite a long time, actually, not just during the heady days of empire, tea was one of those safe commodities on which secure investment returns could reliably be built. But also because, like so much of what seems wholesome, the history of tea is tainted with more than caffeine and tannin. The story of the Magumo tells of livelihoods lost and people displaced, sometimes forcibly from their ancestral land. It speaks of an indigenous culture unraveled with missionary zeal by those who believed it was their right to decide which gods to worship. Kenya is still the third largest exporter of tea in the world, and those displaced by its plantations are still in search of justice. Their case is a challenge to some names well known to us. Unilever, for example. Responding to concerns in 2019, Unilever argued that they'd only purchased the land in 1987, so they couldn't possibly comment on historical claims being made against the British government from the colonial era. But in 2020, Kenyan tea plantation workers took an official complaint to the United Nations against Unilever for failing to protect them in 2007 during ethnic violence stirred up by territorial claims, which killed more than 1,000 people. You can run, but you can't hide. History has a history of catching up with us. Now, we tend to think of ESG as a kind of a formula, sort of tick box exercise. You've got to show you've got it covered, especially if you want to appeal to a woke clientele. But it's not really supposed to disturb the flow. It's not intended to hold back the return to investors or the impulse to invest itself, that mostly self-interested force for good that's deemed to drive social progress forwards. So we get proficient at making lists: palm oil, fossil fuels, weapons, tobacco, gambling, child labour, gender, diversity, the living wage, the negative screening of the ethical fund or the positive screening of the impact investor, the ESG of the SRI that helps sustain the GDP, the acronyms that are meant to bring order to an insecure world and reboot the programme when things go wrong, as they sometimes disastrously do. The collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Dhaka, Bangladesh, 9 years ago, was an utterly predictable, entirely preventable tragedy. The building design was woeful. 4 whole floors had no supporting walls. The foundations were partly built on a swamp. A crack had been noticed in the days before the collapse. Those in the bank on the lower floor were evacuated, but the garment workers were sent back to work. The pressure to fulfill the quotas imposed by international clients proved just too strong. Over 1,300 people died that day, and more than 2,000 were maimed for life. Some of the responsibility lies in the G of ESG. Failures of governments were everywhere, from the absence of building permits to the coercion of workers, from shoddy design to a catastrophic lack of oversight by high street brands intent on delivering fast fashion to avid consumers. No one intended such a tragedy to happen, of course. Compliance was supposed to be a local issue, but nobody truly believed either that hard quotas, low prices, and insecure wages were irrelevant to what unfolded there. Within a month of the tragedy, 220 global brands and retailers had set up a legally binding accord on fire and building safety standards in Bangladesh. 9 months later, the Rana Plaza Agreement established a $34 million fund to provide compensation and support to the victims. The bulk of the money came from international clothing brands. I don't believe that was cynical. There are good funds managed by good people, invested in good companies that care about ESG. I know some of those involved in negotiating the Rana Plaza Agreement. They were genuinely appalled at what happened and determined to stop it happening again. But accords and agreements are no more a solution to the S in ESG than lists and tick boxes are, because there's a deeper issue, and it lies at the heart of the economic model itself. So let's take a step back from storytelling and indulge in a little macroeconomics. Let's start with the economics of the supply chain, and in particular, the distribution of revenues along that supply chain. Once material costs are paid, there are three main destinations for value added: wages, dividends, and capital reinvestment. Any squeeze on revenue sets up an inevitable conflict between those destinations. The economist Richard Goodwin once described it as a predator-prey dynamic, a continual struggle between the returns to capital and the returns to labour. You can probably guess which one he cast as the predator. Technology can make the conflict much easier, particularly if it increases labour productivity and drives down labour costs. During those happy times, you can afford to pay your workers more, increase dividends to your shareholders, and still have enough to invest in the safety of the building or the technology of tomorrow. But what happens when revenues are squeezed by the pressure on consumer prices or by the need to rejuvenate your tangible assets? What happens when labour productivity growth itself begins to decline, as it has done significantly and consistently, particularly across the advanced economies over the last half-century? In the presence of a relentless demand for returns, that decline in labour productivity growth puts an upward pressure on labour costs. It calcifies the contours of the predator-prey dynamic. It heightens the tension between the interests of workers and the interests of the owners of capital. It creates a conflict, too, between the interests of the present, the demand for returns now, and those of the future, the capital expenditures that are needed to maintain the physical assets on which future prosperity depends. The outcome of the conflict is determined by power: the power to settle wages, the power to demand dividends, and the power to set the rules of the game in which production, trade, and financial investment itself are all played out. Again, it's not hard to see where that power lies and where it doesn't. Here's my central point, the crux of things. The S in the ESG is not just a tick in a list of boxes labelled gender, poverty, or working conditions. It's an expression of the essentially social nature of the way in which we organise production, invest in prosperity, and distribute its rewards. Investment is fundamentally social. Wangari Maathai recognised this. In the demise of the Magumo, she saw not only the collapse of fragile ecosystems in the pursuit of wealth, but the damage inflicted on rural women, powerless to defend their own interests and culture. And she decided to do something about it. Giving power back to women lay at the heart of it. Teaching women to grow seedlings and plant trees during the 1970s was the foundation for her hugely influential Green Belt movement, which has since planted over 50 million trees across Kenya and trained more than 30,000 women in forestry, food processing, beekeeping, and other local trades. It's a model which has been copied by other social investors in Africa and elsewhere, sometimes working with women frustrated by the slow pace at which trees grow, Wangari would remind them that the trees that they were cutting today had been planted long ago by people they might never meet. Planting trees is a commitment to the future. It's a form of investment, and it teaches us something fundamental. Investment is always social. It can play itself out as a form of coercion, subjugating the needs and the lives of the least powerful people in society to the desires of the richest in the world. A winner-takes-all gambling casino in which the devil takes the hindmost. Or it can represent a genuine commitment to the future, sometimes to our own future, sometimes to the future of our children, our family, our community, sometimes to the future of those species who share the earth with us, sometimes to a future we may never see. A society grows great, according to an ancient proverb, when old men plant trees under whose shade they know they will never sit. Or indeed, when poor, disenfranchised women in rural Africa do the same. Untrammeled profit can never atone for the damage it leaves behind. The portfolios of tomorrow must systematically place social and ecological returns at their centre. The S in ESG is not in itself enough, but it's an essential starting point for that vital task.
Wow, Tim, this is amazing. Thank you so much. And a lot to digest. We have some time to do that now, and we look forward to having a Q&A with you later in this event. Thank you for now. Now we welcome Bettina to join us on stage, also virtual from our studio in London. Hi, Bettina. You are Director of Human Rights and Social Issues for UNPRI. How did you, over the years, see the social in ESG evolve? And what is the role, in your vision, of the growing regulatory framework?
So they're starting to really pick up the pace. The S of ESG has been, and arguably still is, very underdeveloped. Responsible investors have worked on various social issues for many years, but it has been a bit more ad hoc, typically reactive to certain reputational hits, tragic incidents, allegations, etc. Just in the last decade, we have seen multiple real-world examples of growing inequality, pervasive gender and racial discrimination, shrinking civic space, and the human costs of technological developments. We see examples of ongoing human rights issues, whether it is in our workplaces, communities, complex supply chains, business enterprises, or in nation states. And I think there are three pressure points that have really helped to advance the S. One of them is the growing visibility and urgency around many human rights issues, which are driving expectations, as well as developing a better understanding of investors' role in shaping real-world outcomes, and of their responsibility to do so across all their investment activities. Secondly, as you mentioned earlier, COVID-19 has also served to further accelerate the need to address social issues, especially human and labor rights, and unveiled many of the shortfalls of our economic system. And it demonstrates just how material issues such as workers' rights, access to healthcare, and social safety nets are to business, and provided a very real example of the fact that without healthy people and healthy planets, there can't be any healthy economy either. So over the course of the pandemic, we've seen the crisis exacerbate and highlight these issues. And as a result, people are paying much more attention to social issues than ever before. And we've seen that with our signatories as well at the PRI. And then finally, in addition to growing expectations around responsible business conduct, there are, as you say, increasing regulation and legislation around human rights and labor rights relevant to both companies, but also increasingly to investors. And for example, the recent proposal by the EU Commission on a corporate sustainability due diligence proposal, which outlines due diligence obligations and are aligned with international standards such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, will have clear implications and hopefully positive developments. And I think just in addition to these 3 pressure points, there are also 2 other things I'd like to highlight. Many investors think about ESG risk and how these risks impact their portfolio, primarily. But some are now starting to think about the impact of their portfolio on the real world. They're adding a 3rd dimension: risk, return, and impact. So in addition to our focus on ESG integration at the PRI, we're also working with investors on driving real-world outcomes in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And we believe that investors' leverage enables them to shape outcomes in the world, both in terms of increasing positive outcomes and decreasing negative ones. And finally, as well, I think we're starting to better internalize and understand the interconnectedness of issues. For example, with the pressing crisis around climate change and really understanding the social implications, whether that's through the just transition or understanding what those are in moving in. So at the PRI, we've seen our signatories, as I mentioned, more engaged on social issues now than they've ever been before. And whilst we worked on S since the beginning of PRI and since we were founded, we're now trying to work on them much more systematically. So Irina, do you also see these developments as I assess them? And if so, how does NNIP incorporate the S more into its investment approach?
Well, thanks for the question, also for your first contribution. I couldn't agree more. And yes, we closely follow the developments as you described them, Bettina, and we more than ever incorporate these social transformations in our investment approach. Also, let it be clear, we regard responsible investment as making business sense. We like to be future-proof, and the only way we can make it is by finding that sweet mix of sustainable and inclusive growth with continued profitability. Our approach is about putting capital to work to create value and improve risk-adjusted returns for our clients. The regulatory pressure actually only helps us be part of a real change in a systemic way, because it levels the playing field for us in finance and for the companies in our portfolios. So the social side in our approach is highlighted in, for instance, our restriction criteria, think of arms, tobacco, in our RI norms based on international normative frameworks of the OECD and the UN, ESG integration and very innovative data gathering on, for instance, decent work metrics. And as a shareholder, we exercise our voting right on issues such as board diversity and inclusivity. On the engagement side, we use an inclusion over exclusion approach and set up thematic engagement programs together with experts and stakeholders to address, for instance, child labor in the cocoa sector, modern slavery in construction, and living wage in the garment and agriculture sector. In these collective engagements, we make use of creating leverage with more investors on board. But in all honesty, it is sometimes hard to find data that show positive impact, you were talking about impact, and attribute it then back to us. So I wonder, Bettina, what is your take on that? Is it a little bit unavoidable that with the social, we need that more qualitative, tailor-made approach and maybe a bit more patience?
Absolutely, you do need that more qualitative, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. When it comes to social issues or human rights issues, investors often cite data as a key barrier, and they say that it's too difficult to know how and where to start assessing social performance, and that the S indicators are too hard to measure, partly because there's no reliable and comparable data. And while, of course, that is true, that the social issues are far more complex than some other issues, in so much that we don't have one single indicator, this must not stop investors or be an excuse not to action. And we can't really let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The link between human rights and business is well established, and it is possible and necessary to start using social indicators more. And actually just start, one step at a time. And investors need to identify also what are the most useful indicators to them and use and demand more data. In fact, the more data there is from investors, the better the data will become on the demand. And there is a need to really also define appropriate approaches and metrics to capture when companies are responding and preventing harm to people. So really to move beyond policy and process and capture real outcomes for people. And I'd like to add as well, and as regulation is starting to move fast, we need to figure out the practicalities, especially for investors not accustomed to qualitative due diligence processes. And as you say, we need innovation. What are the appropriate indicators? How do we identify and monitor risks and impacts for large and complex portfolios? And how do we ensure we don't get stuck in that tick box type information and list? And how do we avoid perverse incentives, and how do we really ensure that the information from affected stakeholders reach investors systematically? But of course, data is only one aspect, and you can't get everything from data. But I'm curious, Irina, could you give an example of how NNIP is measuring on an S topic? For example, let's take the living wage.
Yes, so indeed, together with other investors and experts in the platform Living Wage Financials, you know well, Bettina, we developed a method to annually measure the living wage progress with our investee companies in agriculture and garments. We could not really use the data from data providers because they did not dive that deeply into the issue. So our method is based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and tracks companies on their living wage due diligence. So for instance, policy setting, risk analysis, integrating the findings, and transparency. We conduct our own assessments, which I think makes it easier also to talk to experts within these companies. And these annual results are made public and discussed also at an event. So there are stakeholders and rights holders there. This makes this engagement, I guess, a bit more tailor-made and personal, which is needed to be effective. For us, tackling inequality is material for long-term risk reduction. We believe that workers in supply chains deserve a wage that they can live from and send their children to school instead of work. Legal minimum wages, as we know, often do not suffice. Living wages is the key to really have inclusive growth and a just transition towards carbon-neutral economies. It also potentially provides the millions of women working in so-called low-skilled jobs with the opportunity to transform a long cycle of poverty into decent living standards for themselves and their families. So Bettina, listening to this example, and I know you know the platform well. We received the Active Ownership Award of PRI a few years ago. Thank you again for that. Do you think that is kind of a best example for the UN PRI's newly launched bigger, scaled-up collective stewardship program to tackle human rights and social issues?
Yeah, I think this is a really good example of how investors can collaborate with other investors as a way to increase leverage, and particularly important if an investor lacks leverage. I think the collection action element speaks volumes. And as you mentioned at the PRI, we are launching a new collaborative initiative for investors to address human rights and social issues through their stewardship activities. So this initiative will act as a platform that can encompass a broad range of social issues that will allow investors to prioritize the most severe human rights risks and outcomes within their stewardship activities. So as you say, how you engage with companies and company dialogues, but also engaging with policymakers and bringing in the more collective voice. So, the objective really is to maximize investors' collective contribution to the goal of global respect for human rights, where we're looking at 3 areas around the full implementation of the UNGPs, which I think is the framework that you've also used with the Living Wage Financials platform, responsible political engagement, and also further company-specific expectations on human rights issues. So I think it's really exciting to have seen the Living Wage example as a starting point, and I'd like, to really build on that broader for the PRI as well to build on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bettina. I see that we have time for one more question in the chat addressed to you. And the question is, Bettina, what do you think will be the impact of the social taxonomy coming out of Brussels?
So I hope the ideal outcome will be actually the market clarity and also to drive capital flows. So we've seen with the green taxonomy how that's been helping in classifying what is green, and I hope that with the social taxonomy it will help actually identify what some of the social definitions are and really what those outcomes are, because I think there is a risk, of course, whether it's blue washing or green washing or rainbow washing, to have some sort of categorization or better understanding of that. Of course, it's very early on. We'll see. This isn't necessarily going to change until in a few years' time, once everything is being consulted and comes through. But hopefully clearer market flow or market clarity on what we talk about when we talk about the S, and also a way to drive more capital.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bettina, for your contribution today, and looking forward to seeing you soon live. Now, let's hear from my colleague Marina Iodice, who is Senior Portfolio Manager for NNIP's Impact Equity Strategy. She will provide a real-life example of how their investments make a social impact. Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rina. So we spoke a lot about investing in prosperity and what investors should do. And I bet a lot of you are wondering, how does this work in practice? So today I'd like to offer you a perspective from an impact equity investor by sharing a recent investment case with you. But first, please allow me to kick off with a small introduction. Sustainable prosperity for us at NNIP translates into investing in companies that intentionally contribute to achieving at least one of the 14 SDGs that we have selected for our impact equity funds. And as impact investors, we need quantifiable and concrete KPIs and metrics to assess, measure, and then report how these companies are achieving the goals. We categorize the SDGs in 12 investment solutions. For example, enhanced productivity and financial inclusion are two solutions that specifically target, respectively, SDG 8.3, which aims at encouraging the growth of SMEs, and also SDG 10.2, which is meant to reduce inequalities by empowering social and economic inclusion of all. So back to the investment case that I referred to. At the end of 2021, we have initiated an investment in a company that fulfills these two solutions. The company is called Etsy, and it's a US-based online marketplace that is solely dedicated to promoting unique handmade and vintage goods and crafts artifacts. Etsy was founded 16 years ago in the US, and today is a listed company trading at the Nasdaq that generates an annual revenue of over $1.7 billion and employs 1,400 people. But what I particularly like about this company is their mission. In fact, Etsy's mission is to keep commerce human, and it puts itself at the opposite spectrum of e-commerce giants like Amazon, because the company's strategy is based on 3 economic, social, and environmental pillars. The first one, and the one that inspired me the most, was the objective to make creative entrepreneurship a path towards economic security. But the company goes beyond and also aims at enabling equitable access to the opportunities created by e-commerce. And on the environmental side, they also want to reduce the carbon impacts that are generated by their activities and foster responsible resource use. So the societal impact of the company is really in the fact that it enables small entrepreneurs to sell the product of their craftsmanship from their homes. And you can imagine this has been a big economic booster during the pandemic, because it allowed people to continue to have a source of income or even starting a new activity from home despite shop closures and lockdowns. In fact, more than 80% of Etsy sellers, which are about 7.5 million, are women. And we know that women were the hardest hit during the pandemic from an economic perspective, as it's been widely reported also by the UN, among others. Therefore, the impact that Etsy can generate also on gender equality is very visible. Now, these are the characteristics that we look for in companies that will shape the society of tomorrow. Not only do they pursue the trends set out by Gen Z consumers and raising demand for sustainable goods available online, but they also promote equal opportunities. The company, in fact, alone generated over 2.6 million jobs in the independent worker economy in 2020 by connecting sellers and buyers around the world despite the widespread lockdowns. And in addition, it commits to ensure that at least 50% of its small and medium-sized enterprise suppliers are owned by women, minorities, or veterans by the end of 2022. There are many more cases like this, some of which you can find in the annual impact report that we publish every year. And the next one is due in a few months. Because, as I said at the beginning, providing a proof of the impact achieved is very important for us impact investors.
Crystal clear, Marina, as always. Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Doc Farquhar, who is a client portfolio manager for NNIP's green and social bond strategies. Doc will tell us more about this relative new asset class, social bonds.
Thanks, Irina. When it comes to E, S, and G in fixed income markets, environmental and governance have really dominated investor interest in the past. but we've seen a shift in demand in recent years towards social investment products, especially on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic. This has dramatically increased issuance of social bonds in the last 2 years, now with a market value of 360 billion euros. At NNIP, we expect this to continue in 2022, with social bond issuance reaching 250 billion euros this year. So, what are social bonds? Well, a social bond is a regular bond, but with a defined use of proceeds that must have a positive social impact. They're issued by companies and governments to finance new and existing projects that make a positive contribution to society while having no negative impact on the environment. All projects financed through social bonds must provide clear social benefits for an identified target population, such as unemployed, vulnerable and undereducated people. The types of projects funded via social bonds include access to education, affordable transportation, healthcare and food supply protection. All social bonds can be linked to one or more of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. An example is the Council of Europe Development Bank Social Bond, which financed a range of projects, including the development of affordable housing and supporting small and medium enterprises in job creation and preservation across Europe. The social bond market and the traditional bond market share similar characteristics, both in terms of issuer exposure as well as financial characteristics like rating, yield and duration. This means social bonds offer investors an excellent opportunity to replace part of their traditional fixed income allocation without any additional credit risk and benefiting from a higher yield, so investors can actually achieve a positive social benefit without sacrificing returns. Unlike other categories of impact bonds, such as green bonds, defining what is really delivering a social benefit is much more challenging due to the lack of defined standards and criteria that can be used for assessment. The International Capital Markets Association, or ICMA, have developed a set of social bond principles which have been widely adopted by financial markets, but it only stipulates what a social bond issuer should do in order to label a bond as a social bond, not the criteria an issuer should use to select eligible projects across all the different categories. At NNIP, we have developed strict criteria to assess the issuer, the social bond, and the projects that are being financed, which we apply to labelled social bonds. This includes screening the issuer for social controversies and an in-depth analysis of business and financial risk. We also exclude issuers from controversial sectors such as gambling and countries which have a poor track record on issues such as human rights. Once we have assessed the issuer, we then look at the bond. We assess the proposed use of proceeds, the way the issuer selects projects, the management and the reporting of proceeds, as well as the reporting of estimated social impact. To do this, we have developed our own eligibility criteria for each category of project, such as access to healthcare, which we apply to the issuer's social bond framework and through pre- and post-issuance engagement with issuers. We believe a complete market overview is required to screen and exclude bonds that don't match our requirements from the universe. So we initiated and expanded our social bond database in 2021, which is now one of the most complete databases in the industry. The database tracks our in-house assessment of all investment-grade, benchmark-sized social bonds issued in the market, looking at both the financial as well as the social impact characteristics of these bonds. This allows us to have a complete market overview and screen and exclude bonds that don't match our requirement from the universe. Our assessment means that around 25% of all globally labelled social bonds are excluded from our universe. For us at NNIP, the importance of being able to measure and publicly report on the social benefit that is achieved is vital for the credibility of the social bond market and for the broader financial sector. Engagement with issuers, at least annually, to make sure that the data being reported is reliable is crucial, and we map the impacts to the Sustainable Development Goals in our reporting. In this respect, Social bonds are unique in being one of the very few financial instruments that can have a positive impact on SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. Social bonds are a relatively new but fast-growing instrument that investors can use to make a positive societal change. Changes we need to make for future prosperity and a fairer world for all.
Indeed, Doug, Marina, thank you so much for this contribution. Amazing. Let's welcome back Tim for this last part of the day of this event, the Q&A, in which we answer the audience's questions from the chat. If you haven't done so already, please do write your question in the chat by using @Tim, @Marina, or @Doug. But first, Tim, hi, welcome back. Listening to the examples of Doug and Marina, what do you make of social bonds and impact investing? Do you think this can speed up the process of a just transition?
Yeah, thanks, Arena. I mean, I have to say I love those examples. Actually, my writing desk at home was one that I ordered through Etsy. It was made from recycled timbers, and it employed a young man who would otherwise not have had a job. So, I really think that putting capital towards those companies that need it and have a social vision and indeed, as you said, an environmental vision is incredibly important. I think I'd just like to point to one sort of slight conflict. And I love the example of the social bonds and the way that Doug spoke about that. Ideally, you would want more of the capital market to be social bonds. In fact, why just some social bonds? Why isn't the whole capital market social bonds? And that means you want a lot of capital moving into a social sector. And then something really strange happens. It becomes very important that you are focused not just on the social impacts that finance is having, but how the bonds themselves are structured, how the returns are contained, where the money goes from those social investments. And the place you don't want to end up is where you have huge amounts of cash being backed by, for example, some form of government spending, in which the returns to that investment do nothing to the social industries that you're investing in themselves. And in the UK, for example, the massive financialization of social care is just one of those examples where you have private capital rushing into social care. The wages in those sectors become depressed. The returns to shareholders are very good, but they then return out actually quite often into the Cayman Islands or some other tax haven. So the more Doug is successful in bringing social bonds into the market, the more we have to be careful, in fact, about how those bonds are structured and whether the capital itself is helping communities or being drained from them.
Thank you. Very clear. And I'm sure Doug will respond just a little later after the poll as well that we had on LinkedIn. But first, Marina, maybe after Tim's great keynote, what would you like to ask him?
Yes, thank you. I would love to ask you a question, actually, Tim. So your story about post-growth is very inspiring, but in some ways it can also be contradictory to the capital needed to make a transition and achieving the SDGs. So how would you suggest we move towards achieving these goals?
Well, I don't think it's contradictory. I think in some sense post-growth is quite often misunderstood. It's not aiming for a particular level of the GDP. It's not aiming for a particular level of output. In fact, it's the opposite of that. It's arguing that we should not be aiming to have a particular level of GDP. We shouldn't be aiming for economic growth. And that's a place where, of course, yes, if you're investing in the economy, it'll contribute to your GDP, but it depends on the destination of those investments, whether the economy ends up growing, whether the economy ends up making a just transition, whether it meets its environmental goals. And the object of policy is not to target a level of GDP, but to target social outcomes, a well-being economy, an economy in which people are healthy, an economy in which people have jobs and they have decent jobs, an economy in which the conditions of those jobs are good, and an economy that stays within its ecological limits. And that really is the post-growth vision. It's kind of let's get over GDP to some extent. It's been a useful number up to now, but we don't have to always be defining our policy outputs in terms of what number we want that GDP to be.
Excellent. Thank you. Doug, maybe you want to build on this, or maybe you have another question for Tim?
Yeah, no, I think what I'm really interested in, Tim, is with environmental issues, it feels like every day we see real-world evidence of the fact that we need to take urgent action to make a difference on a definitive timeline on environmental issues. On social issues, it's sometimes more difficult to understand the timeline and the sense of urgency. And I just wondered, from your perspective, do you see that sense of urgency to solve social issues? Is it sufficient?
Well, let me say that I see the urgency of the social issues. And that's part of what I was trying to point out in my talk, that their history follows us around. And I think we're looking at the impact of some of those social issues that we failed to address decades, sometimes centuries ago, right now in our social structures, in the social problems that we face, in the conflicts that we have around the world, the way in which poorer people are not still treated to decent livelihoods. Those things do not go away, and they don't forgive us. And I think it's the urgency, in a way, of the pandemic and the lessons from the pandemic. And as you pointed out, Irina, right at the beginning, the conflict in Ukraine, that urgency is with us now. And in fact, our overriding task, it would seem to me, is to put that S first and foremost, as I was arguing. It is the foundation for our investment strategies. It should be the foundation for those strategies. And our failure to put that first now will only lead to deeper, darker problems further down the line. And that, I think, is our take-home, in a way. That's what we should emphasize. That's what we should hold on to. And we should do it not just for the future, but also for ourselves, because there's a sense in which, these wonderful capital markets swaying this way and swaying that way and filling the pockets of those who are lucky enough to benefit from them is not what it means to be human. And even the people engaged in those activities, even the winners in those activities, actually are not fulfilling the best of their own lives, because it takes them away from their humanity. When you begin to look at the social needs around us, that's the point, I think, at which you begin to retrieve your humanity. And that's for the benefit both of those who are investing in that way and, of course, for generations to come.
Beautifully said, Tim. Thank you, and please stay with us, because we're going to have some more questions for you. But as I alluded to, we're first now going to go to the poll question, and that will address the social bonds and the need for growth, I think. So this is the time for the poll question that we posted last week on LinkedIn, which was, what is, according to you, the best way for investors to have a social impact? Is that through impact equities, through social bonds, through sustainability bonds, or through real assets? You can see the results here, and I'm turning to my right. Doug, interesting results. Please, shine your light on these.
Yeah, so no, it is very interesting, but I think it speaks to the fact that social bonds are a relatively new financial instrument, and there's a lot that's not understood. So, Tim raised some really good points around, is there a really defined use of proceeds? Where are they being issued from? The structure. So I think we need to do a lot more education around the fact that social bonds do address all of those issues. So I'm kind of not surprised that it didn't come out top on the poll. Interesting that sustainability bonds have come further up, given that sustainability bonds are a combination of green and social. So yeah, I hope in a couple of years' time we'll see a different answer on that poll. Certainly when you look at the growth in social bonds, I think we need to do a lot more to educate the market.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you. I'm going over to the chat because we have some people wanting to know from Tim. What would be the most important steps to get from the shortism of capitalism to a more integrated stakeholder capitalism with long-term goals that have a positive impact, both social and in terms of long-term financial returns?
Yeah, could you ask me an easy question? I mean, I think my answer would be, to some extent, kind of all of the above. And it seems, and this is the way that I have worked in my professional life, is actually to argue that you have to work at many different stages along, if you like, the supply chain of finance. So you work with, big institutional investors, you work with microfinance, and all along the way, actually, what you need to be doing is putting that sense of the S in the ESG right at the front of what you're doing. And And of course, you know, if you're working in the trade, that depends very much on the rules of the game. The rules of the game are not determined by the people necessarily working in NNIP or Goldman Sachs or anywhere else. They're determined partly, at least, one hopes, by government frameworks that legislate for finance. And so you should also, at the same time as you work within institutional investment, you need to be working with government. You need to be working on policy. And at the local level, the very individual level, what do the questions that you ask yourself is what work is my money doing? Where is it going? Who is it being used for? Who is it helping? Who is it hurting? And those are difficult questions to ask, but in a sense, that is the starting point. And of course, it's both an individual responsibility to ask those questions and also a social one, a government one, a public responsibility.
Excellent answer to indeed a challenging question. For a moment, back to you, Doug, because we have a question in the chat about social bonds. Do you expect social bond issuance to remain high if the effects of the COVID pandemic subside?
So that's a really good question. Yes, we do. I think what COVID-19 pandemic has done is really turbocharged the social bond market, and it's made a lot of participants more aware about it. But actually, social bonds fix a much broader range of social issues than just the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, you know, we think issuance will continue to grow post-COVID-19. You know, Tim raises a really good point. You know, why aren't all bonds social bonds? Well, actually, we're moving in that direction, because if you look at all Euro investment grade bonds that were issued last year, 23% had some form of green, social or sustainable label, up from 17% the previous year. So I think there is a place for a structured product, because you need the guarantees that the proceeds are going to be used to generate a positive societal impact. But over time, why can't all bonds be a green, social or sustainable bond?
I'm with you. Thanks, Doug. So, Marina, a question for you in the chat. How do you assess the intentionality of your investee companies for providing social solutions?
Yes, indeed, intentionality is very important for us impact investors. I would say at the beginning, we look at what the companies report. So we look at their mission, the DNA, but also very importantly, the company's culture. And as we get to know the companies better, then we start looking at what they actually do to put this intentionality in place. So for instance, we look at whether they align their corporate goals with the SDGs, whether they set targets, they report against these targets, and also things like integrating ESG in the executive members' remuneration, or having representation about ESG and impact topics at the board level. Mm-hmm. In other words, we move from the form to the facts.
Excellent, wonderful. Yes, another question. I'm looking live, dear audience, at the chat. For Tim, indeed. So, Tim, structural shifts are often caused by shocks. Do you think COVID and/or the war in Ukraine may be one of those shocks that stimulates society to move past capitalism?
I think it's a shock. You know, we've had two huge shocks to our system in the space of just over 2 years, and that always changes the way we think about the world. It changes our priorities, it changes the way that we think about our future, the way we think about our kids, and it should absolutely change the way we think about the economy and indeed about the demands of a voracious capitalism that undermined, for example, the working conditions of exactly the people who saved our lives through the pandemic and are out there saving the lives of civilian casualties of warfare right now. That idea, in fact, that it's health rather than wealth, which is the fundamental basis of our prosperity. That is a massive shift in thinking. If we can hold on to it long enough, post-pandemic, post-conflict in Europe, then it's something in which we can redefine our priorities. And those priorities change in quite strange ways. You know, when you think about prosperity as wealth, you think about accumulating more and more of it. You think about growth. But when you think about prosperity as health, actually health is much more about balance than it is about growth. And balance means, yes, sometimes that you need more things, particularly poor people in rural villages who don't have enough to eat. They need more food. There's no doubt about that. But balance also sometimes means having less of something, having less of things generally. And through that having less, actually leading richer and more fulfilling lives. And again, it seems to me that was one of the lessons from the pandemic. We focused on the things that matter, and we brought ourselves through that tragic event, actually through very different ways than the ways that we went into that event. We have changed our mentalities. And our job now is to believe in those ideas, believe in those changes, believe in the selves that we found through those challenging circumstances, and build our economy and our society and whatever follows capitalism on those principles.
Thank you, Tim. Health trumps wealth. I'm going to remember that for sure from this event. Doug, another question for you from the chat. In your presentation, you say that 25% of the social bond universe is rejected by NNIP. What is the key reason, and can you give an example?
Sure. So there's not one key reason. There's a range of reasons why something might not be eligible against our criteria. Those reasons typically fall into three categories. So sometimes it's a problem with the issuer. So they may have a high exposure to social risks. They may have had bad practice and they've not done anything from a management perspective to make any change, or that they're issuing the social bond for marketing purposes rather than a genuine commitment to making a positive social improvement. The second category normally relates to the bond. So the way in which the issuer explains what they're going to spend the money on isn't clear enough for us to draw a positive conclusion, or the criteria they use to select the projects don't meet our minimum eligibility criteria. So it tends to be one of those three reasons why we would reject something.
Thank
you. In terms of a negative example, so an Italian development bank issued a social bond. The intent was to finance micro, small and medium enterprises in the southern part of Italy for job creation, job preservation. However, the rules around how they would lend the money were very loose, and it meant that large enterprises who happened to have a small office in the southern part of Italy were eligible, and in fact 64% of the bond's proceeds went to large global multinationals rather than the micro, small and medium enterprises that should have been funded. So it's really important that you look at that as an investor, and Tim raised that concern. I think that's absolutely valid. As investors, we have to be very challenging on issuers and do our homework on the bonds and whether we trust that entity to really place the proceeds where they've said that they will.
Yep. Thanks so much, Doc. Over to you again, Marina, because we have a question here. How do you measure social impact of your investee companies?
Yes, great question. So we measure it by contacting the companies, by talking to them. We basically rely on the public information that they disclose, but as it's been already mentioned also by Bettina, data is not everything, data is lacking oftentimes. So what we do is that we engage a lot with the companies. We reach out to them. In fact, we meet with them at least once a year. So we engage with the IR, the Investment Relations Departments, but also with the board members. And we basically ask them not only to provide data, but also to align their strategy with the SDGs in order to show the intentionality that I was mentioning before and how that plays out in practice. Yep. And we also ask them to improve transparency on the way they manage their ESG risks.
Obviously. Wonderful. Thank you, Marina. Tim, we have a question again from the chat, and it is, what's your view on how to accelerate worldwide demand for impact equity bonds? What's your view on how to accelerate worldwide demand?
I mean, I do think this goes back to something that I said before, which is that financial markets, without some form of guidance, without some form of regulation, they will go their own way. And the dark forces that take capital into places where it creates a lot of profit, but doesn't have that S in ESG in mind, are the ones which will stand in the way of this agenda. It will stand in the way of what you're trying to do. It will stand in the way of what good fund managers in good companies are trying to do to transform investment. And so it does seem to me that the starting point for this is a regulatory one. We actually have to be in a position and be prepared to put policies in place which may curtail what we've for so long agreed is the essence of capitalism, the freedom of financial markets. And that freedom of financial markets should not be a freedom to destroy the lives of other people. It should not be a freedom to destroy the climate. It should not be a freedom in my view, to spread weapons of mass destruction around the world that, in the wrong hands, can cause devastation. And so it does seem to me that, these are tough choices. And of course, I realize the circumstances in which we're talking about those tough choices. But if we can't have this conversation now, we're going to want to forget about it when those tough choices are no longer in front of us. And so taking those choices, taking those principles that you've laid out, that Bettina's laid out, that NNIP is working towards, that Doug has embedded in social bonds, taking those principles is fantastic. But we now have to take those principles to government and say, this is how we want financial markets to work. And it is, in fact, your job as a government to provide the regulatory structure, which means that Doug's job is easier, Marina's job is easier, and the jobs of those who are using capital to destroy our planet and to destroy other people's lives is not just harder, but impossible. And that's, it seems to me, is a job for regulation.
True, thank you, Tim. And we have time for one last question to you. I think it kind of builds on what you just answered. So we have discussed many ways in which we as investors try to contribute to social solutions. My question was, do you think we are on the right track? And I think you already alluded to the fact that we are. But what is needed even more on top of maybe the regulatory frameworks that you're talking about?
I think the one thing I would say, I've been working a long time, and I've been working, in and around investment and social investment and sustainable investment in particular for a long time, and I've seen something very, very interesting, which is that a younger generation of people, a younger generation of investors, a younger generation of fund managers, a younger generation of CEOs gets these points. They are beginning to transform this system from the inside as we speak. And to some extent, I see that in the people that I'm looking at, virtually speaking, right now. You have brought that young energy into investment markets. You have brought those ideas and those ideals to the fore. You have developed those ideas. How do we make that stronger? How do we make it go faster? Where does it go in the future? You bring those young people in. You inspire those young people. You give them, in fact, a sense that the financial markets is not a dirty place to work. It's a clean place to work because it's helping people's lives. And the more that you do that, the more it becomes a virtuous circle rather than a vicious cycle. It is the foundation for the change that we need to see. And that's not to suggest that you kind of wait until, there's a young enough generation that gets the points entirely and transforms the system. You cannot afford to do that. We can't afford to do that. But what you can do, of course, is encourage those people into the jobs that you have, into the programs that you have, towards the ideals that you have. And they will, in themselves and for themselves, move that faster than you or I could ever imagine it would be possible to move.
Thank you, Tim, for those beautiful last words. And indeed, I think I can speak for all of us in saying that we are feeling grateful that we get that space from our organization to do this. And have this conversation today, which was so insightful. We have come to the end of today's session. Dear audience, I would like to thank Tim, Bettina, Marina, and Doug for sharing their insights and their time with us. And of course, a big thank you to you, our audience, for joining us from around the world. We hope that you enjoyed today's session and you take away some food for thought. Note that you will receive an email from us with a link to watch back the recording of this webinar, together with a link to the evaluation survey. We would very much appreciate your feedback on today's session, so we can take this into account for next events. From our side here in the studio, I would like to thank you again for your participation today. We look forward to seeing you at our next event that is called Shifting to Net Zero for Institutional Investors, taking place on the 26th of April. Thank you for watching, stay safe, and goodbye.